The first time I heard about the Verath child, I was elbow-deep in a half-dismantled comm array that had no business still working, aboard a station that had no business still existing. Station Haveth sat at the rim of the Carveth corridor like a tooth someone had knocked loose, but never quite pulled. It had been a trading hub once back, before the consortium collapsed and took the trade routes with it. Now it was a way station for stragglers, a repair dock for ships too old to care about appearances, and a bureaucratic orphan that no government claimed formally enough to fund. The staff were 12 people on rotating shifts that nobody rotated anymore, because nobody had sent replacements in 19 months. We kept things running on stubbornness and creative misuse of components. I'd long stopped filing incident reports, since the only person who read them was me, and I already knew what had gone wrong. The station's original specification had included a staff of 40, 2 active docking bays, a medical ward with actual doctors, and a maintenance cycle that ran quarterly. What we had now was 12 people, 1 active bay, a medical bay with an automated scanner, and a cabinet of supplies I restocked from passing ships whenever I could negotiate for it, and a maintenance cycle that ran whenever something broke badly enough that we couldn't ignore it anymore. We'd learned to identify the difference between things that were about to break catastrophically and things that were merely about to break, and to address them in that order. It wasn't ideal. It kept us alive. I was the station's senior technical officer, which is a title that sounds impressive until you understand that I was also the junior technical officer, the only technical officer, and that the position had been created specifically for me because Commander DeVette needed someone to blame when the water recyclers made the coffee taste like copper. My name is Ren Calloway. I am 31 years old. I am 2 standard years away from a pension I will absolutely not receive because no one is paying into it anymore, and I have a gift for fixing things that everyone else has written off. That gift is the only reason the Verath delegation came to me. Verath Space was 3 jump points coreward from our position. They were a tall people, 2.5 meters on average, with 4 jointed arms they used with a kind of loose mechanical grace, and faces that were built wide and flat in a way that made humans assume, incorrectly, that they were expressing disapproval. Their skin ranged from deep ochre to a pale gray-green depending on their subspecies and regional origin, and their hearing organs, a set of flat, layered membranes behind each temple, like the gills of some deep-water creature rendered in silk, were their most expressive feature and their most important sensory system. When a Verath was pleased, those membranes flushed a warm amber. When they were afraid, they went almost translucent. Grief looked like a deep, still gray. Love looked like gold. I had worked with 2 Verath engineers the previous year, repairing a relay tower they'd installed on the station's upper hull, one of the few pieces of functioning infrastructure we had that hadn't been installed by humans, and correspondingly one of the few that worked reliably. Excellent engineers, patient, methodical. They had a habit of running their fingertips along the edges of components before touching the components themselves, which I eventually understood was a form of tactile inspection, the way I tend to listen to a machine before I open it. We'd communicated through a translation program that rendered their speech as a low, melodic hum with occasional pops of consonant, and they had found my habit of narrating my work aloud. A thing I do, always have, can't stop, apparently hilarious, though I hadn't understood their laughter until the translation program finally caught up and informed me, with a 2-second delay that felt like an eternity, that Ren was talking to the wires again. They weren't wrong. I was talking to the wires again, specifically to the primary fiber bundle in COM Array 3, which had developed a fault somewhere in its midsection, and was transmitting on approximately 60% of its effective capacity, while generating a ghost echo that was showing up as a second voice on any channel running through it. When Haveth's docking AI announced an unscheduled approach, 1 Verath state vessel, classification Royal Auxiliary, requesting emergency berth. Royal Auxiliary. That was new. We hadn't had royalty through in well ever as far as I knew. I set down the diagnostic tool and went to the docking monitor. The ship was already on final approach, moving at the steady, unhurried speed of something with a professional pilot at the controls who wasn't interested in showing off. It was smaller than I expected. State vessels in most species fleets run enormous, because heads of state tend to think the size of their vessel communicates something about the size of their power. This one was the length of a standard mid-range transport, no longer than some of the freighters that put in for repairs. Silver-gray hull plating with the deep cobalt stripe along the flanks that marked Verath royalty in a dozen documentaries I'd half-watched on long shifts. Clean lines, well-maintained, the kind of ship that didn't need to announce itself because whoever was on it had decided that was beneath them. It docked cleanly, which told me its pilot was exceptional, and the moment the airlock pressurized, 3 Verath warriors came through ahead of anyone else, each of them wearing the close-fitting cobalt armor of a royal guard and carrying themselves like people prepared to be disappointed by what they found. I met them in the docking bay because I was the most senior person available who wasn't currently holding together a section of wall. That's not an exaggeration, Technician Os had been running an emergency patch on section C7 since before I'd gotten the approach signal, and she was literally standing inside the wall with her hands on a pressure coupling that was one wrong move from venting atmosphere. Some problems take priority. The warrior in the lead looked me over with the flat, steady assessment that Verath faces were so good at communicating despite the wide flat features humans tended to misread. Ochre skin, membranes folded flat and still in the professional neutral position, I'd learned to distinguish from actual hostility. Her translation implant rendered her words with about a half-second delay, a warm harmonic undertone beneath the consonants, the way Verath's speech always sounded when it came through translation, like music being described rather than played. "You are the technical officer." "I am," I said. "Ren Calloway, senior and only. What can I do for you?" Her serenity requires your assistance. A pause that had the texture of careful word selection, not your station's assistance. "Yours specifically." Another pause. "The engineers who worked on your upper relay spoke of your," a third pause longer, the kind that comes when a translation system is genuinely reaching. "Patients with complicated problems." Patients with complicated problems. I'd been called worse. "Tell Her Serenity I'm listening," I said. The Verath Queen came through the airlock with the particular bearing of someone who has been told she should not be making this trip, and has decided that the opinion of whoever told her this is not the relevant consideration. She was taller than her guards, which I hadn't expected. Most royalty I had encountered, of whatever species, ran to the average rather than the extreme. She wore no armor. Instead, she had a long outer garment the color of deep water, layered and heavy, which moved when she walked with the slow drag of something that had weight and meaning. Her skin was a deeper gray-green than her guards, and her membranes were flushed a deep, muted amber that had nothing warm about it, not pleasure. Something closer to controlled grief that had been controlled for a long time and was getting tired. She looked at me for a moment that was slightly longer than conversational. "You fixed the Carveth relay array," she said. Her translation was faster than her guards, a better implant or more practice with it or both. "When it was rated beyond repair." It had been rated beyond repair, I agreed. The rating was based on an assumption about which components were failing. When I found the actual failure, it turned out to be smaller than anyone expected. "So it was not that the array was beyond repair," she said slowly. "It was that no one had yet found the right question." I blinked. "Yes, that's exactly it." Another look, then without preamble, "My daughter cannot hear." I understood then the weight of the garment and the color of her membranes. Her name was Sevi. She was 4 years old by Verath reckoning, which translates to approximately 6 by human standards. old enough to understand that the world around her was full of sounds she was missing, young enough to not yet have developed the particular form of anger that comes when you've had time to calculate what the loss actually means. She was small even by the standards of young human children, which surprised me. Verath adults were enormous, and I had assumed their children would be proportionally substantial. They weren't. Sevi was slight, with the slightly too large head and wide eyes that young children of several species share, and her mother's wide flat face rendered in miniature, and her pale gray-green skin gave her a faintly luminescent quality in the station's cool overhead lighting that made her look, not unpleasantly, like something from a story. Her membranes, and this was the crux of it, the heart of the entire reason the Royal Auxiliary had put in at Haveth Station, were still. Not folded flat in the professional neutral way of her mother's guards, not flushed any color, still, fixed, unmoving in a way that, once you understood what those membranes were for and what they expressed, was immediately, quietly devastating. The Verath hearing organs are not passive receivers the way a mammalian ear is. I had read about them in the technical documentation from the Relay Project, where their particular acoustic sensitivity had been relevant to how we'd calibrated the tower's signal. They are active systems, layered membranes that vibrate, tune, and refine sound in real time, capable of detecting frequencies and harmonics across a range that makes human audiological capacity look like a child's toy. They can pick up subsonic structural resonance in a building during a storm. They can hear, at close range, the electrical activity in a mammalian nervous system. They can distinguish between the emotional register of a voice and its literal words, because the harmonic layers of Verath speech carry information that their hearing organs decode as a second channel beneath the language. They also communicate emotion and physical state through color and motion in a way that is, for Verath, as automatic and involuntary as facial expression is for humans. A Verath who is upset but trying to hide it has to consciously manage their membrane response in a way that costs visible effort. A Verath child who hasn't developed that control yet is entirely transparent, every feeling visible to everyone who knows how to look, in vivid color, all the time. A Verath with still membranes is a Verath who cannot participate in the most fundamental mode of social exchange their species has, and a Verath child with still membranes, who cannot communicate the second channel, who cannot receive it, who cannot hear her mother's voice in the full richness of what a Verath mother's voice contains, was living in a world that her own species had not been built to navigate without hearing. Sevi had been born with a structural defect in both membrane clusters. The tissue had formed with the layers partially fused in a pattern that prevented the fine-tuning vibration from developing. She could detect some sounds, loud ones, close ones, deep bass rumbles, but the sophisticated layered processing that gave Verath their full hearing range was unavailable to her. She had never heard her mother's voice the way it was meant to be heard. She had never heard music. She had never heard the membrane flush sounds that Verath used to express the subtleties of emotion that words don't carry, which in Verath culture are not optional embellishments but load-bearing parts of communication. She had also, according to the Queen, never once stopped trying. She touched walls to feel vibration. She pressed her palms flat to tables when others spoke. She had developed, entirely on her own, a method of reading the movement of speakers' mouths combined with their gestural patterns and the involuntary microexpressions that crossed their faces. A kind of multi-channel inference about what was being said that was apparently sophisticated enough to fool adults at a distance, until the situation was complex enough that the gaps became visible, and then the gaps were obvious. And then Sevi would retreat somewhere private and do whatever Sevi did when the weight of it got too heavy to carry in company. She compensates, the Queen said. We were in the station's small conference room, which smelled of old coffee and the particular synthetic pine of an air freshener someone had installed 3 years ago to cover up the old coffee smell, and had instead simply combined with it. The Queen sat across from me at the table, her guards posted at the door. Sevi was with the station's medic under guard. The Queen had permitted this reluctantly, I thought, but she'd permitted it, which told me something about her judgment. She has always compensated. She is extraordinary at it. Something in her voice, even through translation, had the quality of pride that comes right next to grief. But compensation is not hearing, and every year it gets heavier because she understands more of what she is missing. No, I agreed. It isn't. The Verath Medic Collective examined her 18 months ago. The Queen kept her hands flat on the table, a Verath gesture I had seen from the engineers, something that communicated deliberateness, a choice to stay present in a conversation that you might otherwise want to leave. They are the foremost medical institution in Verath space. They examined her for 3 weeks. They ran every test they had. A pause. They advised that the fused membrane layers cannot be separated by surgery without destroying the tissue entirely. That external intervention of any kind risked causing inflammatory damage to the membrane tissue that could eliminate even her current limited function. That she will never have full hearing. That she should be a long pause, and this one was clearly not about translation delay. Help to adapt. They gave up, I said. The Queen's expression didn't change. They are not accustomed to being wrong, she said, and they are not wrong by their own methodology standards. The surgery risk is genuine. The tissue architecture is fragile. An experienced surgeon operating under ideal conditions with the best equipment in Verath space reached the same conclusion 3 different times. She looked at me steadily. But you are not a surgeon. No, I said, I'm definitely not a surgeon. The engineers said you approach problems differently. Her membranes shifted very slightly, the controlled grief amber rippling once. That you don't ask what cannot be done. You ask what has not been tried. I sat with that for a moment. Can I see the medical imaging? The files were extensive. Whatever their limitations in imagination, the Verath Medic Collective was thorough to a degree that made me feel briefly inadequate about every diagnostic log I'd ever filed. 3 weeks of examination had generated a body of data that would have taken me 6 months to fully work through. I didn't have 6 months. I did the triage version, pulling the highest resolution structural scans first, then the acoustic response mapping, then the vibrational frequency response tests. I spent 4 hours going through them, alone in my workshop, talking to the files the way I talk to wires. I do this, I've always done this. My mother used to say I narrated everything because I didn't trust my own brain to hold the thought unless I said it out loud too, and she wasn't entirely wrong. Working through something complex, I will explain the whole thing to the room even when there's no one in it, because the act of articulating the problem sometimes shows me things about the problem that reading it won't. It's a habit that people find either reassuring or deeply unsettling, depending on their tolerance for ambient commentary. Sevi found it reassuring. I hadn't noticed her in the doorway until I was partway through the acoustic mapping data, because I wasn't looking at the doorway, I was looking at the display and talking to it. When I registered that someone had been standing there for a while, watching, I looked over and found a 6-year-old alien child in a cobalt jacket that I would later learn had formal significance, leaning against the doorframe with the particular intense attention of someone who is translating from a language they only partially speak. I had been talking to the files for long enough that I didn't stop. I just included her. Fused layers, yeah, I said, pulling up the acoustic mapping. But the layers themselves aren't damaged. Look at this. I waved her in because she was hovering, and the hovering was clearly a question about whether she was welcome, and she was welcome. She came to stand beside me, just slightly too short to see the display comfortably, and I angled it down. The tissue is fine. It's the architecture that's wrong. The layers fused during development, so they're moving as one unit instead of as separate independent sheets. Sound gets in. I cupped my hand to show sound entering, but the system can't do the fine processing, the layered multi-frequency analysis because, I pressed my palms together flat, everything stuck, moving together instead of independently. Sevi tilted her head, looked at my hands, looked at the display, looked at my hands again. Looked at the display with an expression I didn't have the Verath cultural vocabulary to fully read, but which looked, in the ways that mattered, like recognition. She put her finger on the screen, pointed at the dense fused layer mass in the scan image, then pointed at the side of her own head. "Yeah," I said, "that's you." She pointed at the scan again, then made a gesture I didn't understand at first, both hands brought together, fingers interlocked, and then slowly, carefully pulled apart. "Separating." "That's the idea," I said. "Question is how." She made the gesture again, brought her hands together, looked at me. "Not surgery," I said. I'd already been through the collective surgical assessment 3 times, and I agreed with every word of it. Cutting into that tissue carried risks that weren't theoretical, and the gains were too uncertain to justify them. Surgery cuts. This needs something different. I was reaching for an analogy, the way I always do when I'm trying to turn a technical idea into something a non-specialist can follow. It needs vibration, controlled vibration at the right frequencies applied carefully from outside, like working a stuck valve. When a valve is seized, stuck closed, you don't force it. You don't cut around it. You find the resonant frequency of the mechanism, and you work it slowly, coaxing it, until the stuck parts remember how they were supposed to move. I looked at Sevi. She was watching my face, my hands, the display. She was doing the multi-channel inference I'd been told she did, putting together from every available source the shape of what I was saying. I had an idea. It was the kind of idea that sounds insane when you say it out loud, which was part of why I kept it inside while I continued reviewing the data. The other part was that I needed to check whether the physics actually worked before I said anything to anyone who would have to make a decision based on it. I went back to the acoustic mapping. Sevi pulled over a step stool from where, I don't know, she must have spotted it in transit and retrieved it, and climbed up to see the display properly, and we looked at it together in companionable silence. Havath Station had, in storage bay 4, approximately 11 years' worth of accumulated technical equipment from ships and installations that had been repaired here, partially cannibalized, or simply left behind when their operators couldn't afford to take them. I had spent more time in that bay than anywhere else on the station except my workshop, which meant I knew its contents the way a librarian knows an uncatalogued library. Imperfectly, intuitively, with the particular joy of knowing something is in there if you just look long enough. What I needed was a precision acoustic transducer, not a speaker's broadcast. I needed something that could generate targeted vibration across a controlled frequency range, with fine enough amplitude resolution to work at the scale of tissue rather than mechanism. Something survey grade or medical grade, or I was thinking as I walked the bays, running my eyes along the crates and cases and pallets of accumulated hardware. Anything that had ever been used to measure resonant properties rather than just transmit signal. It took me 6 hours of searching. I found it in a sealed crate labeled calibration instruments, XCLAN Survey CORP, which had been sitting in Bay 4 for at least 4 years, and which had somehow never been cannibalized for parts, either because no one else had known it was there or because its components weren't compatible with anything we used. Inside was a full geological survey calibration kit, instruments designed to test the resonant properties of rock formations and structural matrices by applying precise, tunable vibrations and reading the mechanical response. The kit had been designed for use in situations where you needed to know exactly what a piece of rock would do under seismic stress before you built something on it, or blasted through it, or drilled into it. The transducer in the kit was the size of my palm, powered by a small capacitive cell that still had charge, and had frequency and amplitude controls of a specificity that made my chest do the particular thing it does when I find the right tool for a problem I thought I might have to solve with the wrong one. Clean design, precise calibration. The kind of instrument that had been built by people who understood that the difference between the right measurement and the wrong one was the difference between a building standing and a building not standing. I also needed biofeedback monitoring, something to read Verath membrane tissue response in real time so I could see what was happening in the tissue while I worked. The station's medical scanner could generate a tissue response display, but not at the sensitivity I needed, and not with the frequency band specificity that would let me distinguish between a general vibrational response and a targeted layer response. I spent another 3 hours modifying the scanner's output parameters, which involved taking it apart in ways that its original designers had not intended, and which I would need to reverse afterward, because we only had one scanner and I was not going to leave it partially disassembled for longer than necessary. The Queen came to my workshop at the 16th hour, when I was deep in the calibration work, and had been too focused to eat or notice that I hadn't eaten. She brought food, ship's rations, Verath-style small dense blocks of something that smelled faintly of mineral earth and something sweeter underneath, wrapped in a material that kept them at a consistent temperature. She set them on the workbench beside me without comment, without asking whether I wanted them, and that absence of ceremony around the gesture made it feel natural rather than formal. Then she stood and watched me work, which I have opinions about. I don't like being watched, generally, but which I found I didn't mind from her. She watched the way her daughter watched, with real attention, not just presence. "The collective's position," she said finally, when I'd been calibrating for long enough that saying something felt less disruptive than not saying anything, was that any external intervention risked inflammatory damage to the membrane tissue. That the fused layers, if stimulated incorrectly, could scar further and eliminate even the limited function she currently has. "They're right," I said, not looking up. "That risk is real. Any intervention carries it." I finished the calibration step I was on and moved to the next one. But not intervening has a risk too, and it's a different kind. "What risk?" "The risk that she grows up knowing she was given up on." I glanced up briefly. "That's not in any medical chart. It doesn't show up in tissue response data, but it's real and it compounds." The Queen's membranes did something, a flicker of the deep amber shifting briefly toward gold, quickly brought back to neutral. I filed that away. "What are you building?" she asked. "An acoustic therapy device," I said. "Nothing invasive. External application of controlled vibrations at precisely calibrated frequencies, with real-time tissue response monitoring, so I can read what the membrane tissue is doing and adjust continuously as I go. The goal isn't to separate the fused layers mechanically. The collective was right about that. That's not on the table. The goal is to find the resonant frequencies that each individual membrane layer would naturally respond to if they were separate, and to apply those frequencies very carefully, at very low amplitude, and give the tissue the stimulus it has never had and see whether the system can develop some degree of independent response without inflammatory stress." I set down the calibration tool and picked up the survey transducer. "Like physical therapy. For tissue that doesn't know it's supposed to move, because it never has." "Silence." "The tissue is intact," I added. "It's not damaged, it's just architectural. The development went wrong in a specific way, and the question is whether that architecture is permanent or whether it can be worked with." I turned the transducer over in my hands. "The deep sound detection she already has proves the tissue can respond to vibration. The range is limited because the layered processing isn't working, not because the tissue is dead." "Will it work?" the Queen asked. "I don't know," I said, and I said it flat and clear because she had come to me looking for someone who would be honest with her, and lying to her now with false reassurance would be worse than the uncertainty. I know the physics support the approach. I know the tissue architecture is consistent with what I'm proposing. I know the collective was optimizing for surgical risk and ruled out everything that involved physical intervention in the tissue. But this isn't surgery, and the force profile is completely different. What I don't know is whether this particular tissue, in this particular configuration, will respond the way I'm predicting without inflammatory stress. I won't know that until I try. And I'll only try slowly, carefully, with everything I have monitoring in real time, so I can stop immediately if anything looks wrong. And if it doesn't work, then she's in exactly the same position she was before, because the approach is low force and carefully monitored, and I won't proceed past the first sign of stress response. I looked at her directly. I won't promise you it will work. I can promise you I won't make it worse through recklessness, and I can promise you I won't give up on the problem because it's complicated. A long silence. When can you begin? The Queen asked. Sevi was not afraid of my workshop. Most children are either wildly curious about mechanical things or deeply suspicious of them, with very little middle ground. Sevi landed in the wildly curious column with such force that her guards spent the first session quietly preventing her from picking up every tool in reach, which she accepted with the resignation of someone who had encountered similar constraints before, but found them no more reasonable for their familiarity. I sat her in the station's medical chair, adjusted to Verath-child dimensions, which required borrowing 2 components from equipment storage and 15 minutes of rigging, with the modified scanner running above her head and the transducer positioned at a careful distance from her right membrane cluster. The Queen sat across the room, her hands in her lap, her data tablet face down. Her guards were at both doors. The medical bay was quiet except for the station's ventilation and the low hum of equipment. I explained everything to Sevi as I set up. Not a simplified version, the actual explanation, with my hands and the scanner display doing the work that words couldn't, because she was going to be sitting in that chair while I did something to her hearing organs, and she deserved to understand what and why. I am not someone who talks down to children. Children who are given real explanations respond to them. She watched my hands, the scanner, the transducer, my face. 3 times during setup she pointed at something, once at a setting on the modified scanner, once at the frequency control on the transducer, once at a region of the tissue display, and each time she was pointing at something genuinely relevant. The scanner setting she pointed at was one I'd been about to adjust. The frequency control she indicated was the one I'd already identified as the starting point. The tissue region was the zone of densest membrane fusion. You've been reading the research, I said. It came out half convinced rather than fully surprised. She looked at my face, then made a gesture I recognized, her hands held flat, side by side, then one slightly above the other. Levels. She'd been reading what she could find and she was placing herself in the picture. Smart, I told her, meaning it without qualification. She looked at my mouth, then my face, and her expression was one I don't have the right word for, not quite hope, because hope implies an expectation of fulfillment, and she had already learned at 6 years old to be careful with expectations. Something between hope and the deliberate suspension of it. A kind of prepared openness, held at arm's length in case it needed to be put down quickly. I started at the lowest end of the frequency, range the survey kit could generate, well below the range where tissue response was likely, just to establish baseline conditions and verify my monitoring was reading accurately. The scanner showed membrane tissue response in a false color display I'd set up. Blue for no change, warming incrementally through green and yellow toward amber as vibration response increased. At the low end, nothing. I expected nothing. I moved up the range by small increments, watching the display. Watching Sevi's face too, because I wanted to know if she felt anything before the scanner showed it. At approximately 340 Hz, a frequency just below what most humans would identify as a low musical note, the kind you feel in your sternum before you fully hear it. Something shifted. The false color display flickered. A small patch of amber appeared in the upper left quadrant of the right membrane cluster. Small, the size of a thumbnail on the display. I stopped moving, noted the frequency, held it there watching. The amber patch didn't spread, didn't change, just sat there, a small warm spot in the blue. I reduced the amplitude by half and held the same frequency. The amber patch remained smaller but stable. The tissue was responding and it was not generating inflammatory markers. The stress indicators stayed flat. Blue, clean. I noted everything and moved on. Over the next 3 hours, working methodically up and across the frequency range with Sevi sitting very still in the chair. The kind of still that costs something, that requires effort. I mapped 6 distinct frequency bands that produced measurable membrane tissue response without triggering the inflammatory indicators I was watching for. 6 zones of the tissue that were still capable of resonant response, still accessible to vibration, still functional in ways that the collective's imaging hadn't shown as clearly because they hadn't been applying targeted vibration to look for them. When I powered down the transducer and the scanner and sat back, Sevi was watching me with an expression that I couldn't fully translate but understood completely. Something had been different. She had felt something shift in a way it had never shifted before, and she didn't have a frame of reference for what it was yet, but she knew it was different. I looked at the Queen. First session done. Clean indicators throughout, no inflammatory response anywhere in the range I tested. 6 viable frequency bands mapped. I picked up my notes. I want to run 10 sessions before I go any deeper, building tissue familiarity with controlled vibration at these frequencies, before I start working the interlayer zones. If there's going to be an inflammatory response, I want to catch it early in the low stimulus phase. The Queen was looking at her daughter. Sevi's membranes, which had been still throughout as they always were, flickered. Once, very briefly, just at the edge of visible motion, like a flag in a light that might be wind and might be something else. The Queen's membranes, open and controlled in ambergray all session, flushed a warm, involuntary gold. "We will stay," she said. They stayed for 11 days. Havath Station was not designed for royalty, and the Queen accepted this with a practicality that I found, on reflection, genuinely admirable. She ate station rations without complaint. She slept in the guest quarters, which had a mattress from the original fit-out and a ventilation system that worked about 80% of the time and a water temperature that was the system's best effort rather than any target I'd set it. Her guards were professionally unhappy about the security situation and expressed this in the wordless, efficient way of people who are very good at their jobs and know their opinion isn't being asked for. The Queen herself treated the Spartan conditions with a brisk practicality that reminded me of the engineers I'd worked with. There is a problem. The problem is not the mattress. Let us stay focused on the actual problem. Each day I ran a session with Sevi. 1 hour of carefully calibrated vibration therapy, working at the 6 mapped frequency bands, monitoring continuously for any sign of stress response, adjusting amplitude and duration based on the accumulated response data from all prior sessions. I explained the session each day before we started, showing Sevi on the display what I was planning to do and where in the tissue we were working. She had, by the 3rd session, begun to track the scanner display herself, watching the false color map with an attention that looked, to me, less like curiosity and more like self-monitoring. She was learning to read her own tissue response data. I mentioned this to the Queen on the 3rd evening. The Queen was quiet for a moment. She learned to read Verath medical script in order to understand the collective's reports, the Queen said. She was 5. I didn't have anything to say to that. I went back to calibrating the next session's parameters. By the 4th session, I had begun to see something in the accumulated data that I was being very careful not to say out loud yet, because I didn't want to generate expectations that the data might not ultimately support. But I was seeing it. The fused layers were not separating. They were not going to separate, not quickly, maybe not by any significant degree. The collective's assessment of the surgical separation risk extended, in my judgment, to the likelihood of non-surgical separation as well. The structural fusion was real, but the individual layers within the fused mass were responding to different frequency bands differently. Not dramatically, not yet, small variations in the response amplitude map, small differences in the timing of response onset across frequency bands. But the fused tissue was not as uniformly fused as the original imaging had suggested. There were zones of tighter fusion and zones of relatively looser adhesion, and in the looser zones, something like differentiated vibration response was developing across sessions that hadn't been present or hadn't been detectable on the day we started. It wasn't full Verath hearing. It wasn't going to become that, not from 11 days of external acoustic therapy in a station medical bay. But it was not nothing, and the trajectory was moving in a direction I would not have been willing to predict on day one. On the 8th day, I had the therapy running at the 4th frequency band, one of the middle range zones that was showing the strongest response development across sessions, when Sevi went still in a completely different way than the careful stillness she maintained for therapy. Her eyes tracked right, suddenly, without build-up, just right to a point in space, the way a person's eyes move when they hear something unexpected from an unexpected direction. Her hands, resting in her lap, pressed down flat against her thighs. I checked the equipment instantly, everything running normally, no change in the parameters. Then I heard it, the low, characteristic resonance of Chief Engineer Morel, running the docking bay's magnetic clamps through a maintenance check in the corridor outside. It was a sound I'd heard so many times I'd stopped registering it as a sound, processed it automatically as background and moved on. It traveled through the station's structure at a frequency that was close, though not identical, to the band I was currently running in the therapy. And the modified scanner, which I had running at maximum sensitivity because I was in the middle of a session and watching for small changes, showed a response in Sevi's right membrane cluster that was not from the transducer. She had heard it. Not clearly, not with anything like the richness and complexity that full Verath hearing would provide. But the therapeutic stimulation had sensitized the tissue enough that an external sound, the right frequency, the right amplitude, conducted through the station's structure, had produced a measurable response in membrane tissue that had not been producing measurable responses to external sound since her birth. She looked at me, then at her mother. The Queen was across the room. She had been quiet all session, as she always was, present, watching, not intervening. She looked at her daughter and at the scanner display, and something in her face shifted in a way that the wide, flat Verath features could nonetheless communicate without ambiguity. I kept my voice very steady, because the data needed to be clear. The right membrane cluster is showing external stimulus response that wasn't present at baseline. The tissue has developed sensitivity to external sound in the therapeutic frequency bands. I looked at the display. She's hearing something she couldn't hear before. The Queen crossed the room. She moved like someone who was not running and was also not walking, and crouched down in front of Sevi's chair so that her face was level with her daughter's. Level in a way it wasn't from her full height. And she said something in Verath, without translation, just the melodic hum and pop consonants of her native language, at a pitch, and register that the translation program would have taken out of real time to render, but that was meant for Sevi, not for me. Sevi went very still, the third kind of stillness I'd now seen from her, different from the therapeutic stillness and the sudden attentive stillness. This one was the stillness of someone who is receiving something very carefully, not wanting to miss any of it. Then she said something back, one short phrase, unsteady but deliberate. The queen's membranes went so deeply, intensely gold that the color seemed to come from inside rather than from the surface. I looked at the scanner. The scanner was irrelevant right now. I looked at the wall instead. The translation program caught up with me later. I asked it to process the room audio from that moment, because I needed to understand what had been said, not out of voyeurism, but because understanding would help me calibrate the remaining sessions. What the queen had said to her daughter, crouching to her eye level in the medical bay of a station at the edge of nowhere, was, "I hear you, my love. I have always heard you." What Sevi had said back, in the voice of a child who was not certain the words were landing the way she wanted them to, but who was saying them anyway, was, "I think I heard you say that." I ran the remaining sessions differently than the first 8. Differently in character, not in method. The method stayed rigorous. The monitoring stayed continuous. The parameters stayed conservative. What changed was the quality of Sevi's presence in the process. She came to each session knowing what she was working toward in a way she hadn't before the 8th day. She sat in the chair with a focused patience that I associated with people much older than 6, watching the scanner display with an attention that I had stopped thinking of as curiosity and started thinking of as genuine understanding. She had mapped the false color display to her own sensation. I could see it in the way her eyes moved between the display and whatever she was feeling in the tissue, cross-referencing the internal and external representation of the same data. She was running the experiment on herself and reading the results with the same seriousness she'd applied to her own medical records at 5 years old. On the 9th day, she tapped my arm during a session, a single deliberate tap, not distress, the code we'd worked out on day 2 for pause. "Let me communicate something." I paused. She pointed at the scanner display, at a region in the left membrane cluster that I had been tracking but that had shown slower response development than the right. Then she made a gesture, her index finger moving in a small, spiraling pattern, that I'd learned was her indicator for something she was trying to describe that she didn't have vocabulary for yet. I adjusted the left cluster approach for the 9th and 10th sessions based on her indication. The response development in the left cluster accelerated in the 10th session, past what I had projected. I would think about that for a long time afterward. The idea that she knew what the tissue needed better than I did, because she was in it, and she developed a vocabulary for her own sensory experience that let her communicate something I couldn't have measured from outside. On the final session, the 10th full session of targeted therapy, the scanner showed improvement across all 6 frequency bands. The right membrane cluster, the one I'd worked on most, and on which I'd started earliest, was showing over 40% improved response from baseline. The left cluster was behind by about 10%, consistent with the slower development I'd seen and the mid-course adjustment. The inflammatory markers had stayed flat across all 10 sessions. Clean, no stress response, every measurement I had. It was not full hearing. It would never be exactly what it was supposed to be. The structural fusion was real and remained real. She would still miss frequencies she would have had if development had gone differently. There would be harmonics and layered resonances in Verath's speech that she would receive only partially, moments in complex acoustic environments where the gaps would be visible. But she would hear her mother's voice in the register that mattered. She would hear music. She would hear the membrane flush sounds that carried the emotional sublanguage of her people, the tones that exist below vocabulary, the channel that Verath used to say the things that are too true for words. She would hear enough to participate in her world in ways that had been closed to her before. I put together a complete documentation file, methodology in full, the frequency mapping data from every session, session-by-session response measurements, with the full monitoring output. The final comparative analysis showing baseline against end-of-course response across all frequency bands. I added a section on the mid-course left cluster adjustment and noted that the approach had been partially guided by Sevi's own sensory reporting, which I flagged as significant. A methodology note for anyone who used this approach in future, which was that the patient's self-reporting of internal sensation was a valid data source that should be actively incorporated, not just collected. I handed the file to the Queen with the explicit suggestion that she take it to the medic collective, not as a rebuke, as a starting point. They had the resources, the expertise, and the institutional scale to apply this approach across the full population of Verath children with similar conditions. My methodology was rough, something built in a storage bay with a survey calibration kit and a modified medical scanner. What they could do with the underlying principle, with proper equipment and proper funding and proper research protocol, was an order of magnitude beyond what I'd managed. The Queen read through the file standing in my workshop. She read it the way she did everything, steadily, fully, without performance. I found something to do at the other end of the bench while she read, which was mostly just moving things from one location to another in a way that resembled work. When she finished, she looked up. "This is thorough," she said. "Comes from working alone," I said. "When you're the only one who will read your own notes later, you make them good." A pause. "Then the collective will resist this." "Probably," I said. "Show them the data anyway. They're not wrong to be conservative. Any intervention carries risk, and caution has kept a lot of patients safe that recklessness would have harmed. But being systematic about known risks sometimes means you don't see approaches that don't have those risks. They'll see it once the data is in front of them. They're rigorous, and rigor eventually follows the evidence." "You think well of them," the Queen said slowly, "for people who told you it was impossible." "They told me it was impossible by their methodology," I said. "That's not the same thing, and their data was excellent. I couldn't have done this without their scans." I was reading their work for 4 hours before I had an approach. I was building on what they'd found, not starting over. I set the transducer down on the bench with the small regret I always felt at the end of a project. Disagreeing with someone's conclusion isn't the same as disrespecting their work. The Queen looked at me for a moment. The same long, slightly longer than conversational look she'd given me when she first came through the airlock 11 days ago. "What do you want?" she asked. "In compensation. The station needs," she looked around my workshop, and her expression did something with the wide flat Verath features that communicated, with perfect clarity, an assessment of the gap between what the station had and what it should have. Significant support. "The Verath Crown can provide resources, equipment, material assistance. I will speak with your commander." "Station would appreciate it," I said honestly. "Commander DeVette can tell you better than I can what's most urgent. She's been holding this place together on a budget that gives me nightmares, and she never complains about it, which means you should definitely ask her about it." "I will." A pause. "And you, personally?" I thought about it. I thought about it the way I think about problems, looking for what's true rather than what's appropriate to say. "Sevi's okay," I said. "That's enough." A long pause. "Ren Calloway," the Queen said. There was something in the way she said my name, and I have thought about this since, tried to describe it and mostly failed. But it was something in the register underneath the words, the harmonic layer that Verath speech carries, that the translation program didn't render because it rendered words not music, that changed the shape of what followed. "My daughter wanted me to ask you something." "Okay." "She wants to know if you have a family." I looked at my workbench. "Not nearby. Parents are back on Earth. No siblings. It's mostly just me and the station." The Queen was quiet. Her membranes shifted through a color I hadn't seen from her, warmer than the controlled grief amber, not the sudden overwhelmed gold, something steadier than either. A warm, deep yellow gold that seemed like it had been there under the surface, and was now, for the first time, being allowed to show. "She also wanted me to tell you," and here the Queen paused, and for the first time in 11 days the pause seemed less like translation delay and more like she was choosing how to carry something carefully. That you sound like family to her. She met my eyes. She has been watching how you work. The way you talk while you work, to yourself, to the tools. The way you worry about the station. The way you stayed in here for 16 hours before you let yourself stop, because you needed to understand the problem before you would say anything about it. The Queen's warm, steady gold membranes were fully open now, unhurried. She told me it feels like the way her uncle talks to his fishing boats, as if he loves them and is also a little bit exasperated by them and would never actually abandon them. I didn't have an answer for that. I'm not someone who tends to run out of words. I ran out of words. In Verath, the Queen said, we have a word for people who are not blood family but who are held the same way. Keth. It describes someone who is inside the circle, not because they were born there but because they earned their way in, or because they were found, or because something recognized them as belonging there before anyone had words for it. She looked at me steadily. My daughter calls you Keth. Her membrane stayed warm and gold. So do I, she said. The station's ventilation chose that moment to make the noise it makes, somewhere between a sigh and a complaint, the sound of a system doing its best against circumstances that did not support its best. I had always found it vaguely companionable, that sound, a thing working hard at something. I looked at my hands, looked at the transducer on the bench, looked up at the Queen of the Verath, standing in my workshop in the warm gold that was not something she showed to everyone. Thank you, I said. It wasn't enough. It was what I had. The Royal Auxiliary departed the following morning. Sevi came to say goodbye in the cobalt formal jacket, with her mother and all 3 guards, and the docking bay was fuller than it had been at any point during the visit. I stood with Commander Devet, who had already spent an hour with the Queen discussing the station's infrastructure needs, and who had the particular expression of someone who has just had a conversation that substantially altered their expectations about how the next several months were going to go. Sevi came to stand in front of me directly, which required her guards to step back, which they did, watching the process with the resigned professionalism of people who had accepted that the small person they were guarding would do things that were not on any protocol list, and that their job was to make sure those things were safe rather than to prevent them. She looked at me for a moment. Then she pointed at the wall of the docking bay, the station's hull, the structure around us. Then she pointed at her own head, at the membrane clusters that had been still for 6 years and were no longer fully still. Then she made the separating gesture, the same one she'd made on day 1 when she was pointing at her own scan on the screen, hands together, then moving carefully apart. The first time she'd made it, it had been a question. This time it was something else, a statement, an acknowledgement of something that had opened. I pressed my palm flat to the wall of the docking bay, the way she always pressed her hands to surfaces when she was trying to feel vibration, the way she'd taught herself to hear what other people heard without thinking. She looked at my hand for a moment. Then she pressed her own hand flat against the hull of her ship. I don't know what she heard. I don't know how much had developed in the days since the 8th session, or how much would develop in the months and years of continued natural development with stimulated tissue. I hope she heard a lot. I hope it kept getting richer. She looked up at me one more time. Her membranes flickered warm amber, brief and clear, the clearest motion I had ever seen from them. The first time they had moved like that with something deliberate in it, not just a flicker at the edge of possibility. Then she turned and walked up the ramp of the Royal Auxiliary, and the Queen followed her, and the guards followed the Queen. The ship cleared the docking collar with the clean, smooth competence of the excellent pilot at its controls. The clamps released. The bay went quiet. I stood there for a while in the quiet. Commander Devet stood beside me, not saying anything, which was a courtesy I appreciated. Somewhere in the station, Morel was running another maintenance check, and the low-frequency resonance of the magnetic clamps traveled through the structure and into the soles of my feet, and up through my skeleton the way bass frequencies do when you're standing close to something large and humming. I thought about a child pressing her hand to surfaces, learning to hear what moved through them, mapping the world in vibration because that was what she had, and working with what she had with a seriousness and a patience, and an intelligence that I would not have predicted from anyone, let alone from someone 6 years old who had every reason to be angry and who, as far as I could tell, was not. I went back to my workshop. There was a comm array that needed attention. There was a water recycler that had developed a new flavor profile that was different from the copper profile, which meant a different failure mode, which meant a new problem to find. I picked up the diagnostic tool. I started talking to the wires. 3 months later, a Verath supply shuttle arrived at Havath Station on an unscheduled approach that the docking AI flagged as priority, 6 cargo containers, addressed to Commander Devet from the Royal Crown of Verath, containing equipment, structural components, medical supplies, and technical materials that the manifest described as general infrastructure support. There was a note on the manifest, in translation, for the station that does not give up on complicated problems. Commander Devet cried in her office for about 10 minutes and then came out and began organizing the most efficient resupply operation Havath Station had seen in years, which was the most Devet response to being moved that I could have predicted. In the smallest cargo container, separate from the rest, sealed and marked for personal delivery, was a package addressed to Ren Calloway. Inside was a survey calibration kit, new, professional grade, built to specifications that made the old Zelen kit look like a student project, the kind of instrument that a civilization with real resources and real medical research infrastructure would build for the purpose I'd improvised toward. And a folded piece of material in the color of deep water, the color of the Queen's outer garment, the layered heavy color that I had learned was meaningful, which I eventually understood after some research was a Keth cloth, the Verath token given to someone who has been recognized as inside the circle, something you're supposed to keep. There was also a drawing. Verath children apparently draw differently than human children. Human children draw figures, people, animals, houses, trees. Verath children draw sound. The marks they make are representations of vibration patterns, resonance, acoustic waves rendered in the visual medium the way a musician might transcribe what they hear into notation. I couldn't read it technically. I didn't have the framework for Verath acoustic notation, but I could read what it was because I'd seen the display it was based on. It was the scanner readout from the 8th session, the moment the false color map had shifted from blue to amber. The warm spot in the upper left quadrant, rendered in a child's careful hand in ochre-yellow lines on a pale background, with the larger context of the tissue map around it and the frequency indicators along the edge. She had drawn it from memory, or from the session recording she must have asked her mother to request. She had drawn the moment the tissue had responded, the moment something had begun to open, with the fidelity of someone for whom that moment was a landmark. At the bottom, in Verath script that I fed to the translation program, was one word. It said Keth. I put the drawing on the wall of my workshop, above the workbench, between the comm array schematic I kept for reference and the window that looked out on the docking bay. I put the Keth cloth on the shelf beside the new calibration kit. Then I picked up the diagnostic tool. There were complicated problems waiting, the way they always were, the recycler, the array, the half-dozen things that were in the category of about to fail rather than already failed and which would arrive in the already failed category at some point that I was trying to delay. The station sighed its ventilation sigh. The magnetic clamps hummed somewhere distant in the structure. I got back to work. That's what I'm here for. I have always known it. I will keep knowing it for as long as there are things that people have decided cannot be fixed. They can usually be fixed. You just have to find the right frequency.